In 1975, I was transferred from the WCSE AM radio department to the WCSE TV production department. Now, one of my main jobs was to do the daily book, which was a combination of commercials and tags and station IDs. Now, this job had been handled by Charlie Hall, but he decided that he no longer wanted to do it. For those first few days, Charlie educated me in the proper way of doing this. And during this time, I told him that this wasn't the first time that I had seen him in person in the studio here at Channel 5. You see, back in 1954, this 10-year-old kid with his mom was about to travel across the United States to California, where he would then travel across the Pacific Ocean to Okinawa, where my dad was stationed at that time. One of Mom's relatives suggested that I go on a Saturday morning children's program on Channel 5 and tell everyone about this trip. While sitting in the peanut gallery, I noticed a young dark-haired man wearing a white short-sleeved shirt with a skinny tie behind a large piece of plexiglass that had an outline of South Carolina on it. Yes, this was the map that Charlie Hall used. After telling Charlie this 1954 story, he looked at me with his arms folded and he said, "You know, I remember you." We both laughed and started talking about the early years at Channel 5. He told me that he had an early LP recording that was made by Dick Reeves and engineered by Cecil Keels with narrator Carol Godwin, and asked if I'd ever heard it. Well, I said no, and this really piqued my interest, and Charlie eventually lent this LP to me. Unfortunately, I never had the chance to return it, but I hope you enjoy this Blast from the Past, a tour of historic Charleston with Dick Reeves and narrated by Carol Godwin.
Charleston, South Carolina, a city where today's modern world rubs elbows with the rich lore of yesterday. A cosmopolitan city with a proud and tumultuous past, stretching back to 1670 when the first settlers arrived in Carolina. A city whose present-day inhabitants managed successfully to coexist with history, enjoying the fruits of technological progress while still maintaining the continuity of experience handed down from past generations. The visitor from away soon discovers that time is measured differently in Charleston than elsewhere in today's bustling world. Perhaps because of its small size, Charleston is a place where people can and do take time. Time to walk the narrow streets. Time to visit with friends. To stop and chat with the flower women lining the fence near the post office. To admire the enduring beauty of moss-covered brick walls or a breathtaking cascade of wisteria. And to listen to the unforgettable sounds of the city. The soft musical cadence of Charleston voices, church bells chiming the hour, the taunt of a mockingbird, the cry of seagulls swooping over the battery. It takes time to know Charleston, time to stroll streets that have witnessed the passage of 300 eventful years, time to listen to sounds, many of them unchanged since earliest days. And the best way to get to know Charleston is to start out early in the morning here on High Battery with one of the city's many excellent guides. Here, where the waters of the Ashley and Cooper rivers lap against the famous seawalls and gulls chatter overhead. This morning, we have Dick Reeves as our host for this delightful trip into the past of a proud and beautiful city.
How do you do, you all? It's another beautiful Charleston day here on High Battery. And I'm proud to be with you good people and point out some of the many, many points of interest in my native city. Behind us is the old city, and in front of us, Charleston Harbor, often referred to as the harbor of history. It's ringed by picturesque sea islands, guarded by historic fortresses, scene of many of America's most important, yes, monumental battles. Looking toward the harbor mouth over yonder on your left is Sullivan's Island. site of Edgar Allan Poe's famous mystery tale, The Gold Bug, and Fort Moultrie, that palmetto log bastion that fought off a French-Spanish invasion fleet in 1706. Many years later, on June the 28th, 1776, the same fort soundly defeated a mighty British fleet. And this gave America its first military victory of the Revolution. On your right over yonder is James Island, location of Fort Johnson, built in 1704 as the first fortification of old Charlestown. From Fort Johnson on April 12, 1861, the Confederates fired the first shot at Union-occupied Fort Sumter. Sumter, rising in mid-harbor right before you, is the youngest of Charleston's forts by nearly 200 years. The fort that in 1863 helped to turn back the mightiest ironclad fleet ever assembled up to that date and gave the United States Navy its most devastating defeat prior to Pearl Harbor. Now, this fort, according to history, received the first shot in the Civil War. But you know, history sometimes forgets another shot that was fired a few months earlier. On January the 4th, 1861, word was received from New York that a steamer named Star of the West had been secretly chartered by the United States Army to bring supplies and ammunition to reinforce Sumter. Very quickly, the forts surrounding Charleston Harbor were garrisoned with South Carolina military forces. A detachment of mere boys stationed on Morris Island was made up of volunteers from the Citadel Military College of South Carolina. On January the 9th, when the Star of the West was sighted, Major P.F. Stevens, battery commander, gave the order for the first shot to be fired across the ship's bow. The Star failed to turn about, and another shot struck it on the port side forward and still another aft. The ship had no orders to return fire and quickly escaped from the danger zone. But the first shot in the war between the states had been fired across the bow of the Star of the West by Citadel Cadet G.W. Hainsworth. Now the sounds of guns that split a nation are still, and all that remains of the cry of seagulls and the lap of the waves. The early morning sun settled softly over White Point Gardens, nestled in the toe of the ancient city's southern peninsula. You can feel the soft breezes that rustle the palmetto fronds and whisper through the magnolias and live oaks that shelter memorials to the city's proud past. Adding to our rich experience of the morning, let's continue our trip by stepping into the horse-drawn carriage awaiting us here at White Point Gardens. Here we are. I hope you're comfortable, are you? I'll take my seat up with the driver and his dog. Now let's continue. The area you see here, according to earliest records, was known as White Point or Oyster Point because of the great accumulation of oyster shells on the site. In the early 18th century, rocks were dumped along the Cooper River to form a barricade. Additional material was added through the years until the wall reached its present height. And then it became known as High Battery, or High Battery, as some Charlestonians call it. In 1838, it was made a promenade. And in that same year, White Point Gardens was laid out. At one time, and this is an interesting fact, a waist-high wooden fence surrounded the park, and the only entrances were through turnstiles opposite Church and Meeting and King Streets. The purpose of the fence and the turnstiles was to keep out cows, horses, mules, and inebriates, with a fine of $5 to be imposed on anyone who violated the ordinance. Another remarkable ordinance, and one which was not repealed until well into the 20th century, prohibited all smoking of any pipe or cigar within the enclosure of the gardens at White Point or on East or South Barries, under penalty of $5 for each and every offense. Now, you may laugh with me, ladies and gentlemen, but those were the laws of this ancient city. During azalea festivals in years past, Charleston's picturesque hucksters used to gather here for an annual competition of street cries. The ranks of the hucksters have thinned out in recent years, but if you listen carefully in the early mornings, you might hear the song of the shrimp vendor or the occasional cry of a vegetable woman as she offers her wares. Recently, I heard a more up-to-date street cry by a little Negro newsboy. Look out your window, peep out your door, I got your Sunday morning news and choreo. Here in White Point Gardens, the city's past is well documented. A Revolutionary War cannon used in the defense of Charleston in 1780, a monument commemorating the Hunley, first submarine to sink an enemy warship, the pirate marker that tells of the capture and hanging of 2 pirate crews buried in the marsh off White Point in 1718, the capstan from the USS Maine, sunk in Havana Harbor in 1898, the USS Hubston memorial that commemorates the sinking of a Charleston-based minesweeper, April 26, 1952, doing training maneuvers in the Atlantic. And at the southeast end of Murray Boulevard, you see there the distinguished monument to the defenders of Fort Sumter, 1861-1865. Now, as we leave White Point Gardens and continue north along East Barry, the broad mouth of Cooper River stretches off to our right. On the left, facing the water, stand some of Charleston's stateliest homes, tall, gracious mansions that reflect the lives and tastes of the many generations that have dwelt behind wrought iron gates and fan-lighted doorways. Most of these dwellings, as you can well imagine, were built in the early years of the 19th century at a time when many low-country planters were beginning to establish mercantile businesses. A number of these homes are patterned after the single house developed in the 1700s, with the gable end facing the street. The house was only 1 room wide, allowing breezes to blow freely through high-ceiling rooms. It has been said that one reason the houses were oriented with the narrow end to the street resulted from the custom of levying property taxes according to the footage lining the street. Now, you will notice, good people, that many of these homes have piazzas stretching along one side and handsome doorways opening on the street, a style that became popular immediately following the Revolution. These piazzas afforded not only privacy and safety, but also took advantage of the prevailing sea breezes blowing off the battery. There's a romantic legend told in Charleston about one of these old homes. The house was built in 1755 by a prosperous Cooper River planter. Years later, during the British occupation of Charleston, the planter's granddaughter eloped from the home with a British Army captain. The pair managed to reach St. James Church, Goose Creek, several miles north of the town, only to have the clergyman refuse to perform the ceremony. Undaunted, the bridegroom held the cleric at pistol point and conducted the marriage himself. But their happiness was short-lived. Not long thereafter, the captain was killed in a skirmish near Charleston. Continuing north, we passed Trad Street, running west from East Bay, and one of the original streets in the city. This narrow little thoroughfare was named after the Trad family, whose nearby home was the birthplace of Robert Tradd, said to be the first male white child born at Oyster Point. Reminiscent of Charleston's 18th century waterfront district is the row of multicolored houses known today as Rainbow Row. Built close to the street, as you see, with common walls, these rather tall, narrow buildings with slanted roofs were converted into private residences just a few years ago. Now painted in a variety of pleasing hues, pink, yellow, mauve, green, buff, and blue, accented with contrasting shutters and wrought iron grillwork, the first floor windows partially hidden from the street by a row of palmettos and oleanders. These houses along Rainbow Row have become some of the most desirable residences in the city. Originally, they were built by merchants who conducted their businesses on the first floor and lived with their families on the floors above. In order to reach the living quarters, they walked through an arched passageway to a secluded garden at the rear, then climbed an outside staircase to the upper apartment. One of these houses along Rainbow Row was built by an Irish immigrant named Joseph Dulles, who conducted a successful hardware business. Many years later, one of his direct descendants, John Foster Dulles, as you will recall, became Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. Now take a look at the quaint little tile roof building at the corner of East Bay and Exchange Street. It was known as Harris's Tavern and is noted for its spacious wine cellars extending underground for nearly half a block. Now, if this seems to you an excessive amount of storage area for such a small shop, let me tell you that in 1763, with a white population of only about 5,000, there were 66 persons and firms licensed in Charleston to sell liquors. That's an average of one license for every 75 people. Think of it. It would appear that Goose Creek water was not the only beverage for which early Charlestonians thirsted. Now then, the impressive building right over there at the east end of Broad Street is the Exchange Building. Our driver will stop here so that we may take a closer look. Please watch your step getting out. Thank you, driver. That'll be all. This building was completed in 1771 and occupies one of the most historic pieces of land in the city. In January 1774, the Provincial Congress met here to set up the first independent government established in America and to elect delegates to the General Congress meeting later in Philadelphia. President Washington was officially received here during his visit to Charleston in 1791. Relics from earliest history, including portions of the 1701 seawall, are preserved in the basement museum known as the Provost. With its brick walls, vaulted ceilings, uneven floors, the Provost remains much as it was during the Revolution, at which time General Moultrie stored a quantity of powder and arms in a sealed-up corner of the basement. It remained there undetected all during the occupation, despite the fact that the British used the basement as a prison for many of Charleston's leading citizens. Lifelike reproductions provide a glimpse at that corner where Moultrie hid his valuable stores, and the dungeon area where men and women were imprisoned in a dark, airless cloister, sharp reminders of this painful struggle for a nation's freedom. Now then, we shall leave the Exchange Building for a stroll for a few blocks along Broad Street, frequently called the Wall Street of Charleston. As you can see, this street is lined with an odd assortment of facades, a reminder that the area was a residential as well as a business district. Within these converted residences, we find lawyers, brokers, real estate and insurance agents, conducting their businesses in offices whose interiors recall the elegance of the 19th century. In spite of its functions as the city's financial center and the motor traffic that crams the street during business hours, Broad Street still maintains a leisurely, unhurried pace, and it's been said that more business deals are consummated along its uneven flagstone sidewalks than within the offices themselves. In recent years, a large, easy-to-see timepiece has been affixed to one of the newer buildings, but as far as Broad Street itself is concerned, time continues to be measured by St. Michael's chimes, the same chimes that for over 200 years have reminded businessmen when it was time to go home for their 3 o'clock dinner. A dinner likely to include such favorites as okra soup and red rice. The street's business section extends for approximately 3 blocks between East Bay and King Street. It was once known as the Broad Path, which led travelers to the city gates. King Street is now the main shopping district of Charleston and is one of the town's busiest arteries, despite its one-way traffic. I venture to say that Broad Street is the only street in America where a firm that printed currency with the Confederacy is still in operation. Walker, Evans and Cogswell Company, over there on the south side of the street, was founded in 1821 and was a well-established concern in 1861 when it was named lithographers and printers for the Confederate government. It produced stamps, banknotes, bonds, and various other documents in this same building until 1863, when it was moved to Columbia for safety. Ironically, its stock and machinery were destroyed in 1865 during Sherman's March. After the Civil War, the company returned to Charleston and resumed business operations in the same building on the same spot. Now that's a romantic business story, isn't it? The building right here at 16 Broad, note the eagle in the gable, was built in 1817 to house the Charleston branch of the Second Bank of the United States. This was the only bank in the state to resume business after the Confederate War, and one of very few in the South to redeem currency issued prior to the war. In 1926, it became the South Carolina National Bank. The great number of fire insurance companies represented on Broad Street reminds one of the city's past. The first mutual fire insurance company, let's call it by a shortened name, the Friendly Society, was formed in 1755 by a group of prominent citizens. Because of the ever-present threat of fires, other companies sprang up during the last half of the 18th century, most of them patterned after the original Friendly Society. As a rule, each of these companies maintained its own engine house and subsidized its own volunteer fire company to protect the property of its subscribers. Buildings belonging to policyholders were designated by the company's plaque, placed on a wall where it could be seen from the street. Some of these plaques can still be seen on homes and buildings in the city. The system had its disadvantages. When the bells of St. Michael's rang out an alarm, all the volunteer companies, sometimes as many as a dozen, hauled their engines to the scene, each trying to see if the building bore its individual plaque. If it didn't, the company returned to its engine house. To correct this problem, the city offered a substantial premium to the volunteer company that first fought the fire. Nevertheless, the volunteers with their bucket brigades were hard put to control anything more than a minor conflagration. By the 1840s, hand pump engines were being used, but these too were pitifully inadequate once a fire got well underway. Not until the Great Fire of 1861 was the first steam engine used. By the way, membership in these various volunteer companies was a distinction sought after by the young men of the city. The honor was by invitation, and members not only paid dues but also bought their own uniforms, all for the privilege of risking their necks, fighting fire, and taking part in the company's revels. Now, good people, we have reached the corner of Church and Broad, where we really ought to stop for a few minutes at the Hunley Museum, in the basement of the old Bank of South Carolina building. Built in 1797, this is believed to be the oldest bank building in the United States, still used as a banking office. In 1966, the citizens and Southern National Bank completely restored the building and installed this unique museum as a gift to the people of Charleston. Lady, may I help you down these narrow steps? There we are. Now you see a full-scale model of the Hunley and associated exhibits, providing us with a graphic picture of naval warfare in Charleston Harbor during the war between the states, or the Civil War if you prefer, including the accounts of the world's first submarine to sink an enemy ship in time of war. The Hunley, first submarine bearing a warhead torpedo, was brought to Charleston from Mobile, Alabama, where it had been built in a desperate hope to break the Federal fleet's blockade. It was simply an iron cylinder, 30 feet long, 4 feet in diameter, with the ends of the cylinder closed to a point. Adjustable diving planes were placed on each side, with a hand-operated propeller at the stern. This fishboat took 2 crews to a watery death in trial dives in August and October 1863. On the night of February the 17th, 1864, the tiny vessel and her 3rd crew of volunteers made a final gallant effort which was to assure them forever a place in the annals of naval history. On that night, the Hunley's torpedo rammed directly into the heart of the Union sloop of war, Housatonic, sending both victim and victor to the bottom. Today, ladies and gentlemen, the Hunley and her crew rest undisturbed in deep waters off Charleston, waters where now the giant Polaris submarines come and go. Now then, as we leave the Hunley Museum, it's just a short block west of the famous intersection of Meeting and Broad, crossroads of the city's municipal life, with the United States Post Office and Federal Court on one corner, the County Courthouse on the other corner, the City Hall on the 3rd corner, and St. Michael's Episcopal Church on the 4th. This is known as the corner of the 4 laws. In the early 1700s, when Charleston was surrounded by fortifications, the town's main landward entrance was located here with a drawbridge and a moat. A favorite tourist stop here is the handsomely proportioned council chamber in City Hall with its notable collection of historic portraits. The most famous, and one which attracts art connoisseurs from great distances, is Trumbull's full-length portrait of George Washington, said to be worth $1 million at least. Across Broad Street from City Hall, its chalk white steeple rising 190 feet, stands St. Michael's, the oldest church edifice in the city, and certainly the city's most famous landmark. The cornerstone was laid in 1752, and the building was completed in 1761. Its architectural style is attributed to James Gibbs, who designed St. Martin's in the Fields, London. The interior is typical of its period, including the large pew for the royal governors and council, the pew in which Washington worshipped in May 1791, and then the high pulpit with its inlaid sounding board. The bells in St. Michael's steeple are beloved by Charlestonians of all faiths because of their intimate involvement in the city's great historical events. Brought from England in 1765, The bells were taken back during the Revolution as a prize of war, but later returned to Charleston. 2 of the bells were cracked at different times and were again sent to England to be recast. During the Civil War, they were removed to Columbia for safekeeping and were burned there in the Great Fire. The metal, however, was salvaged and once again returned to the same English foundry and the same molds from which they were originally cast. For more than 200 years, they have been the familiar voice of the city, calling to worship, announcing the time, sounding alarms, joyfully marking great events in the nation's history, sadly tolling catastrophes. At one time, the only weddings at which the bells could be rung was the marriage of a daughter of the senior warden. The vestry finally relented, however, and nowadays the 8 bells are rung for the marriage of any communicant. They're also used for change ringing in the old English tradition, for playing tunes and sounding the quarter hours. For special holidays, secular tunes are played, such as 3 Blind Mice, used on June the 28th, Carolina Day, the day forces of General Moultrie held off the British in 1776. The playing of that particular tune is thought to have had some political significance at the time. Whatever its original meaning, the jaunty sound of 3 blind mice each year recalls America's first great victory over the British. Good people, I hope I haven't bored you with all this history. I shall bring my spiel to an end with a description of this tiny churchyard where we are now, the final resting place of many illustrious figures, including General Charles Cotsworth Pinckney. A high brick wall separates us from the din of street noises. This churchyard offers welcome quiet, an escape from the everyday world. A few moments for contemplation while you read the ancient inscriptions or watch a mother bird feeding a nestful of young. And here, in this restful haven, we shall end our incomparable stroll through historic Charleston as the late afternoon sunlight filters through the foliage and warms the aged and weather-worn stones. Thank you all for letting me be your guide on this typically beautiful Charleston day.
Charleston, a city marked by history, favored by nature, graced by the heritage of generations. A city whose lusty past has ripened into gracious maturity, setting it apart as a unique bridge between 20th century America and her tumultuous youth. Life goes on in Charleston, as it has for 300 years, as it will continue to do. Each evening the sun sets over the Ashley, and for a few minutes the sky is a constantly changing kaleidoscope of color, from palest pink to deep mauve, and the whole city is washed in its reflected light. Then darkness comes quickly, as it does in southern latitudes. Later the moon rises, silvering the rooftops of the old houses, casting its magic glow across brick walls into old gardens. St. Michael's chimes the midnight hour, marking the passing of another day in the long history of Charleston.